Okay, well, hello and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining today's session on finding the missing piece to your Office 365 package. I hope you're all well, staying safe and looking forward to a little more freedom in the coming months. I know I am. And just to let you know, we are recording the session today. And if you have any questions throughout this session, then please feel free to ask them via the Q&A session, or the Q&A panel, I should say. We've got a short agenda. You'll be glad to hear, with the main premise being around the fireside chat around cyber resilience. But first, some introductions. So my name is Richard Enderby. I head up the cybersecurity practice for CDW within the UK. I've been here for around 5 years now, but I've spent just over 23 years working in cybersecurity. And it's definitely a place where we've seen lots of change and evolution over the years. And not just within security, but also around some of the main applications that we use, and also how you protect your users on a daily basis. And I'm pleased to say that I'm joined today by Jay Peter, who's an 8 times awarded Microsoft MVP and Mimecast Tech Evangelist representative, who's widely recognized in the industry as a thought leader around Microsoft and email hygiene. But Jay Peter, I don't want to do you a disservice, and it's great to have you on today's session. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself, please.
Sounds great. Greetings. It's nice to be with you, Richard, and nice to be with everyone today. A little bit about myself. As you mentioned, I'm an 8-time awarded Microsoft MVP. And for those that aren't aware what that is, it's an award that Microsoft gives to individuals who are leaders in various technical community buckets. So for years, I was an Exchange MVP, and that was my focus, on-premises Exchange. And then once I embraced M365, they moved me into the Office Apps and Services, which is actually the Office 365 bucket. And so this is a thing that you can't test for, you can't apply for it. It's something that Microsoft acknowledges, that folks who are journalists, they're speakers, they're bloggers, they try to help the community. Microsoft acknowledges them with the MVP award. In addition, I'm the co-founder of Clip Training, which is a provider of Windows, Office, and Office 365 training, and that's through portals for organizations to use. I'm also a technical speaker. I speak for Microsoft and others. I'm a journalist for many years. I would tell you what I do in my spare time, Richard, but as you can see, I don't have much spare time. So this is all I've done for the last 25 years.
Well, lockdown's definitely helped you do that. I'd say that for sure.
Yes, although it's funny, Richard, because, here for virtual backgrounds and such, you choose to elevate your status to this beautiful home. Me, I'm living in like some kind of factory building with the brick wall. I'm going to work on my virtual background for the next one.
I'll settle for a change of scenery. Don't worry. I'm sure most people would. Look, great introduction. Thanks for introducing yourself. Now, just to get things started and maybe a bit of entertaining for the background, can you give us your take on Microsoft 365's offerings, and did you always see it becoming as massive for Microsoft as it has done over the past years?
I'd love to be able to say that I predicted this, that from the moment I saw it, that, I knew that this was just going to blow up into the, tools of the 21st century, that it was going to be the best communication, collaboration, and cooperation suite that we'd ever seen. I wish I could say that. As a journalist, I was covering the story, and you got to understand, I was an on-premises Exchange MVP. And so I would write articles in InfoWorld and say things like, stay out of the cloud. And with good reason. Everyone was sort of leery of the cloud in the time that I was writing. I was all about hyper-converged architecture and avoiding, Office 365, especially since the predecessor to that was BPOS. And so I was not, an immediate convert. What ended up happening was I wrote another article about staying out of the cloud, and I got a call one day from folks at Microsoft. And they were like, Jay Peter, we're calling about your article. I don't know why, but when Microsoft calls me, I always hear Captain of the Enterprise. I always hear William Shatner. That's no matter who's on the line, that's what I hear. And so they were like, look, you do understand we're moving to the cloud. And I'm like, no, that's just a fad. Well, I was wrong, obviously. And I'm glad that they helped to change my mind on the subject. I'm glad they were able to show me the vision of where it would be today, because honestly, I feel like the tools that we have today for collaboration are so much better than what I consider now the anti-collaboration tools of email in the past. um, now we have tools that really allow us to work together. So I'm on board today. I love where it's at today, but no, I was not always a super fan.
Yeah, and it's going to be quite. I'm quite keen to see, where this kind of journey takes Microsoft. Obviously, with the cloud, and I think there's a lot of work going on with moving, Exchange on premise into cloud for sure. And just actually, I was going to slip in another question here actually about that. I mean, where do you see customers at the moment in that transition? Do you think most organisations will look to move to the cloud for their Exchange and their email services?
I do. I do see that. I'm seeing that more and more. Years ago, I would ask an audience, of several hundred in front of me. I'd say, how many of you are moving to the cloud or thinking about moving the cloud or, and I'd get a few hands. Um, and they were hesitant to even admit it. But now it
Mm.
seems like it's flipped. Everyone's either already in the cloud or they're moving there. And they have various reasons for doing so, whether it's the pandemic, which helped a lot of organizations to decide to make that move. Satya Nadella, very early on in the pandemic, said that we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months' time. And so now, of course, we're a year in. So how much have things evolved in terms of what they offer? You could see every day, it seems like they put out new features for teams and other things like that. But also, people have evolved and have learned to work with these tools. And that's something I try to facilitate through my own personal company, facilitating learning how to use these tools so that you can improve your overall, what I like to call your collaboration maturity index. So, this is where I think we're seeing this shift even more so now, and we're moving even faster to the cloud than before.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think there's a number of things that come to mind when I look at these type of SaaS-based services. One is how you develop features and to push out new features or enhancements to what could be hundreds of thousands of deployments inside networks and data centers is quite tough, and it's easy obviously to introduce those features into SaaS apps, but two other things, the main thing is obviously availability. I think Microsoft has pretty much got that sorted. And the third thing for me is security. And, having worked in security a long time now, over 20 years, we do hear expressions such as good enough security, or is 70% good enough? Or, obviously there's a cost versus risk factor in there. I mean, what are your thoughts when you hear these types of expressions?
There's a lot of things you can apply the term good enough to. But typically, when you agree, it's to things that you don't really care a lot about. When it's something that you care about, whether it's, maybe you just love coffee, right? And you get a cup of coffee. It's very rare that you're just like, oh, it's good enough. No, if you really care about, this is something that you are focused on, then you want it to be better than good enough. So the question really for folks is, well, how much do you care about your security? How much should you care about your security? When I hear folks say, well, it's good enough, I worry. I say, well, that sounds like, you haven't put a lot of thought into it, and you might be leaving yourself open to an attack. And unfortunately, there has to be some kind of crossroads between how much you do put into it, because there's a cost attached, obviously. There's also an unnecessary um, uh, thinking in terms of you don't want to double up on things you already have, right? That doesn't make sense. I believe personally in defense in depth, but I also believe in diversity of that defense in depth. There's no reason to double up on one thing. Instead, spread it out so that you have everything from the gateway through to the endpoint and even the human to ensure that you have defense in depth spread out properly. The other thing that's interesting is sometimes folks will say to me, well, look, Jay Peter, I don't have an endless budget here. So if I'm looking at where to put my budget, where should I focus along the cyber kill chain? And honestly, that's a great question, because when you look at the metrics, they say that 90+% of all attacks start with an email, some kind of a phish. And so if that's the truth, if it's 90+%, and I've seen everything from 94 all the way up to 97%, then you have to say to yourself, well, if that's where the attacks are primarily coming from, then the gateway would be my first concern, making sure that the email gateway is as secure as possible. And that's, if you're looking for where to focus your budget, that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Multi-layers approach, as you say, cost versus risk, as I just mentioned, and yeah, that cyber kill chain. I think I've been using that stat of 90% of attacks generally come from an email or use of an email for about 3 years now, and it's still very relevant in today's world, which is good. I mean, on that layered security, things like, and you mentioned there about overlaying solutions. Typically, if I look at Mimecast, look at Microsoft, Mimecast is a third-party solution. And what I mean by this is, some customers will have already, purchased an M365 subscription, so they feel that, purchasing a third-party solution on top is paying for something they already have. Or maybe they haven't, and maybe they should get it from Microsoft. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, that's a good question, actually, as far as something they already have. So it's funny because I get asked this question a lot. I was recently asked this question. I was doing a presentation in South Africa, and someone in the audience asked me, they said, am I not just paying for the same thing? If Microsoft already has it built in, why would I pay again for something that they're already offering? There's a couple of thoughts on this. But the way I responded back was, I said, think of it like fences. Microsoft is a great home builder. In fact, I would say the best in the land, right? So you have them come in and build homes in a neighborhood. And the question comes up, how are you going to secure those homes? Well, Microsoft is not a fence builder. They've never been a fence builder. In fact, I always say we've never trusted Microsoft to protect Microsoft. And a good example of that is when we look at systems like Windows and such, we typically put a third-party solution on for, again, that defense in depth layered approach. Here's the thing. Some would say, oh, well, is that negative? I don't think it's negative. I think it's a matter of respecting Microsoft for what they do really, really well. They build incredible systems. They build incredible cloud-based solutions. They do that really well. But now, what about what they're providing from a security perspective? Well, so I liken it this way. Microsoft has Exchange Online Protection, which I liken to a 2-foot picket fence. It'll basically keep the critters out, but it's going to be an anti-spam and anti-malware based solution, the basics. It will not protect from spear phishing. It will not protect from attachment issues like ransomware, malware, things of that sort. So Microsoft only sells 2 fences. They have their free version, the EOP, 2-foot picket fence, or you can get a 4 to 5 foot, shadow box fence, which will go a little further in terms of it'll keep out those opportunistic attacks where folks are trying to just see what they can get out of your organization. Those are the spear phishing, ransomware, malware type attacks that, ultimately they do have some form of attachment protection. They have some URL destination scanning, right? But now, is that the strongest and best fence you can get? That's something you actually have to pay for. Either you buy it a la carte or you have to up your licensing to an E5. So at that point, you're saying, wait, if I'm spending money, am I getting the level of security that I desire? Again, is good enough, or do you want more than just good enough? And that's where we look at the third fence. That's where I see third parties, especially Mimecast. It's a 10-foot steel fence with barbed wire and sentinels and video cameras and guard dogs. And, so you say, well, okay, it's a great illustration. It illustrates the variety in terms of options. But at that point, we have to look at, okay, what is the true feature set of these solutions? And then what is the efficacy level in terms of the quality of protection for each of these? And that's a completely different story.
Yeah, no, I agree with this. I'm loving the analogies as well of the fences. I think it does sum up very, very well. Just on that, I mean, obviously, Microsoft, they have a number of protections today, as you say, depends on the 2-foot fence, the 4-foot fence, or you need to go get a different fence. But where do you think Microsoft will go the next few years with their security, especially around email and efficacy, etc., around some of the attacks? Do you think they're going to push a little further and introduce new features, more features, acquire? I mean, did you have any thoughts on that at all?
It seems obvious that they're putting some effort into this, side of things. So we do understand that they are going to improve over time, of course, and they already have shown that they're willing to do that. I feel, however, that they're distracted right now with a lot of other things. There are pieces to the Exchange story that have been sitting there unfinished from a programming perspective for many years now. I'll give you one example. So we look at on-premises Exchange servers, and let's say you've decided you're going to move to the cloud. So you move your mailboxes to Office 365. Well, you still need to retain at least one Exchange server on-prem because there's an issue with Azure Active Directory talking to Exchange online. We don't have that problem with on-premises. Exchange on-prem can talk to Active Directory without an issue. And so ultimately, you keep this one server in play that's running the hybrid configuration connection, and this allows you to make changes to attributes and such within the Exchange environment, and it goes up to the cloud. That's somewhat silly at this point. It's been years that we've been asking for this to be resolved, because when you go into the cloud, you don't want to continue to have an on-premises server there, and yet it still continues. So what that tells me is it's not saying that Microsoft doesn't want to do it. They've said repeatedly they're going to fix this, but they're very, very busy. What are they busy working on? Teams, right? Obviously, this is their bread and butter right now is Teams. So I'm not saying that security is not going to improve. I'm just saying it feels like it's not top of mind for Microsoft. They've offered their EOP solution, their advanced threat protection solution, which is now called Defender for 365. They're going to continue to look at it and work on it. I'm sure there's some people working on it, every day. But we're
Yeah.
not seeing tremendous strides in development the way we see with other solutions that they're laser focused on. I just don't think they're laser focused on security. I don't think Microsoft, at the highest level wakes up every day and says, what are we going to do about security? Whereas a third-party security organization, where that's their primary focus, that's what they eat, sleep, drink. And, they wake up every day saying, how do we improve our security solution? That to me is a better front-end protection.
Yeah, no, I definitely tend to agree there. So third-party solutions all the way, by the sounds of it. Now, I'm still looking at your picture here and loving some of the images that you've got. Have we got any kind of actual data that we can show people today, though, around some of these features, etc.?
You want data. You don't just want cartoons.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
I like. I think the cartoons are great at telling the story, but I think sometimes people want to see something on the screen that just tells them a little bit more around what we're talking about.
I'm with you, and I can do that. The funny thing about these cartoons is um, that's how I think in my head. I think illustratively, and so I have a cartoonist in the UK. Doesn't everyone? And when I get one of these ideas, I throw it at him and I just say, "Can you please, develop this for me?" And it's helped me to be able to explain what's going on in my head. But yes, you're right. We need data, and that's where, here's one example of some of the things I was just talking about, whether it's EOP, ATP, or Defender for 365, and then third-party solutions like Mimecast. If you look at this right here, this is just attachment protection. We could have more and more charts for every subject, whether it's URL destination scanning type solutions, or whether or not we're talking about things like homoglyphs, and whether or not we're talking about internal email protection or impersonation attacks. So we could do a chart for everything, and I have those charts, but I wanted to just share one today: attachment protection, because malware and ransomware, these are attacks that are constantly coming in, and we say, well, great, all right, so how does EOP, ATP, or Defender and third-party solutions, how do they measure up? As you can see, EOP has nothing. Now, that's not a slight against Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't promise attachment protection in EOP. So if an attachment comes in, if it's a known malicious, scenario, and they already have this, where there's signatures and such, there is some protection in that regard. But if this is an attack that requires some type of attachment scanning, they don't have that in EOP. So right away, everyone who thinks, well, I already have the free EOP, I don't need to pay anything extra to Microsoft or anyone else. Well, no, you're very unprotected. That's not good enough. It's not even there. So the next level is ATP, or Defender for 365. Now you'll notice there's some green, there's some yellow. So there is an attachment protection solution there. When an email comes in, Microsoft takes that and puts it into a sandboxing solution. Now, sandboxes are different. The Microsoft sandboxing solution is an Azure VM, and so it's a software-based sandboxing solution. And what it does is it checks to see if this is a weaponized attachment. If it detonates, then it won't pass it on. If it's clear, they pass it through. Now, we don't have a lot of details on what's going on behind the scenes here. For example, do they use time incrementation? That's where you can advance the time back and forward in order to see if you can poke this thing into detonating. Well, we don't know. Do they use more than just AV signatures? Do they use heuristics and other things? We don't know. We can assume, however, that they use some or all of those things, but we just don't know. There's not a lot of transparency there in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. But now take it to the next level. Third parties, Mimecast. Mimecast does use a sandboxing solution. They have a hardware emulated sandboxing solution, which some would say, well, what's the difference between hardware emulated and software based, as in the case of Azure VMs? The difference from a security perspective is if an attachment wakes up in a sandbox, if it can detect that it's in a sandbox, and I'm sorry if I I personify these things, I make them into, living things, but if they wake up in a sandbox and they can tell, you know what they do? They remain dormant. So that's the trick. You've got to make this thing feel like it's in a real system. And so a hardware emulated sandboxing solution tends to do better. And so that again leads back to efficacy. When we look at the numbers, we see that third-party solutions like Mimecast do a better job of catching the ransomware and the malware that's coming through better than what Microsoft does. And that's why when you look at third-party reviews of Microsoft versus other solutions, Microsoft tends to rate much lower because their efficacy levels are not as strong. I think in part because of the features themselves. In the case of using a software emulated sandbox and using one that, again, we don't have a lot of transparency on, as opposed to Mimecast, where they do time incrementation. They do have AV signatures as well as heuristics. They do have other solutions as well to protect against attachment issues. So, for example, this is where innovation comes into play with third-party solutions who they wake up every day and this is what they live on. Mimecast has a solution called static file analysis. What it does is it looks at a document. It doesn't even have to sandbox it. It looks at the document, at the bits and bytes, to see if there's any executable code. If you get an image that came in, there should be no executable code. PDFs, Word documents, and such, if there's executable code, it sets off red flags. And the greatest part about this is it's file agnostic. It doesn't matter what file it is. It looks at the bits and the bytes to see if there's any executable code. And because it's static, it doesn't have to throw it into a VM of any sort, or it doesn't have to open it up in the sandbox. It can do this very, very quickly. So they do use sandboxing, but they also have this static file analysis, which to me is just, it's not just cutting edge, Richard, it's bleeding edge. And that's what I like to see out of my security solutions. I like to see some innovation. On top of that, they also have another solution where they take the document, they convert it to PDF, which is 100% effective in eradicating any form of malware or ransomware. If you've got a Word document that comes in and you convert it to PDF before you deliver it to me, well, now I can read the document and I can see what I need to read. Typically, I just need to read the document. I'm not always editing these documents, so I can see it. But that conversion process basically eradicated any chance of malware surviving. It just can't survive the conversion. So this is where it gets really exciting to me. Solutions that have incredible features lead to greater efficacy, and it's provable. And that's why, although I like to speak in cartoons, I also like to show data.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, you're definitely convincing me that I should buy Mimecast instead of Microsoft. But on that though, I mean, do you see, Mimecast being more complementary, or it almost sounds like they're being, obviously a competitor, which I suppose they're both. But what are your thoughts?
That's a great question. In the past, we didn't have to think about it that way. With on-premises Exchange, and anyone who's been around long enough to have played with Exchange on-prem, we all know that Exchange Server needed to be surrounded by this ecosystem set of solutions because there were things that just were not built into on-prem Exchange. We didn't have a secure gateway solution, so we would get one. We didn't have an enterprise-grade archive, so we would get one. And maybe it was software-based, maybe it was a hardware appliance, maybe it was cloud-based when those started to come out. But ultimately, we knew we had to surround Exchange on-prem with this ecosystem of solutions. But now we move to the cloud, and all of a sudden, the idea is, oh, well, everything's built in. We no longer need to bolt on anything else. And my feeling on that is, no, no, no. There are definitely things that are now built in that weren't built in before. We need to acknowledge that. And there's no point in spending money on things that are already built in, that are truly enterprise grade and worthy of, our consideration. But security and other features like even enterprise archive or continuity, these are things that are not really built in. And we could talk, I could talk for another hour about that, but ultimately I don't see Mimecast as a competitor. No, not in any way. I see Mimecast as something that enhances what Microsoft provides out of the box. Just like our
Sure.
on-premises days, we had to bolt on. In this case, when you bolt Mimecast on, what do you get? Well, you get improved security. Well, doesn't that make you want to use M365 even more so? If you're even leery of moving to the cloud, having better security, having a one-to-one with what you had on-prem and now moving to the cloud, isn't that what you want? And then on top of that, if you're using Mimecast for the enterprise grade archive for continuity, now you're assured that even if M365 goes down, which it does from time to time, you're able to keep working. Not just working, but working in a secure fashion, working with compliance in mind. That's where all of the pieces come together. And I think the only difference from the past is that whereas in the past you would probably go with different solutions for each of those buckets, archive security, monitoring, and such, today you don't want to daisy chain multiple solutions onto M365. So it's better to go with an all-in-one solution. But the challenge there is that the all-in-one solution has to be able to cover everything, right? Archive security, continuity, and all these other features. And it has to do all of those things at the best level. Otherwise, you don't want to get a solution that's, great in security, very bad with archiving. That's not going to work. The all-in-one has to have everything at the best level. So that really limits your options. It limits your choices. And ultimately, that's where when I looked at the scenario and I said, okay, Microsoft came to me and said, I've got to get on board with M365, right? You remember that story at the beginning, right? They said,
Yeah.
Peter, we're moving to the cloud. They convinced me. But I said, if I'm going to be able to talk to my customers about this, if I'm going to be able to recommend M365, I have to be able to give them a one-to-one. I can't say if you move from on-prem with all of the additional pieces and you move right to M365, it's going to be a one-to-one. That's when I found Mimecast. That's when I realized, wait, there are solutions out there. And it was the Office 365 PM who I was talking to on the floor of an Exchange conference. And she said, I said, well, what do I do? And she said, go talk to Mimecast because they have a solution that's an all-in-one that'll bolt on and will give you all the things you're asking for. And there it was. So yeah, I don't think it's M365 versus Mimecast, not at all. I think it's with Mimecast. And you can see from my cartoons, which, again, show my thinking, why I believe that.
Yeah, it definitely looks like a cloud on steroids, that one, which is probably a great way of explaining or Mimecast security. Talking about online exchange, I've had a question come through actually saying, do you see the recent Hafnium attack, as a reason for organizations to abandon, on-premise exchange once and for all and move to M365? I know I spoke earlier as well about customers making that transition, but do you think that attack's going to speed up that process?
Honestly, I do believe that it's going to affect people who are kind of on the fence. There are some organizations that they remain with Exchange on premises for a reason, and nothing has shifted that thinking just yet. They're going to stay. This type of an attack, may knock a few more people, into making the decision to move to the cloud. But I think it's an odd scenario because, we're talking about gaps in Exchange Server, in the code itself for Exchange Server that existed for over a decade. And this was the first time they're being taken advantage of. And it's, Microsoft's been criticized by how quickly they reacted to this. They found out about it in January. We got patches in March. But honestly, that aside, that's a different question. As far as whether or not you should now say, oh, we can't do on-prem Exchange at this point. We got to move to the cloud. We've been doing Exchange for 25 years on-prem. So no, I don't necessarily think this should be the reason to move to the cloud. I think there are other great reasons to move to the cloud. I wouldn't do it as a reaction or a panic to this type of breach. So if you were already on the fence, fine, it might push you a little further over. But for those folks, and I work with some organizations that have quite, pretty large Exchange deployments, and ultimately they're not going anywhere at this point. So yeah, it's hard to say.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's great. So in summary, obviously we agree there. I think Mimecast definitely a complete complementary suite of technologies that customers should take advantage of, which is definitely going to reduce the risk of compromise, and especially over the top of what Microsoft provides today. I like the fact here that looking at this slide you've just put up, you've included the APIs and the ecosystems around integrations, etc., which I think is going to be really key for us all moving forward. But do you want to just take us through some of these additional layers so we can?
Yeah, so I mean, when we look at, security in the past, we always looked at the perimeter, right? We looked at the targeted attacks coming in through zone one, as we say. And so you would always focus on that, spam and targeted attacks. But we have to look at other layers and other zones. For example,
Mm.
zone two is internal. Zone three is beyond your perimeter with things like brand exploits and domain spoofing. That's where you start looking at things like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. The API side, where you take advantage of existing investments already. You've already made the investment. So, these are all things that we have to look at. And that's where Mimecast really comes into play because, from a zone one perspective, they have definitely looked at this and said, okay, so we provide our secure email gateway and targeted threat protection. That's great for the first zone. What about internally? Well, they also have internal email protection, and then they have awareness training. You want to strengthen that human firewall. Granted, they're always going to be your weakest link, but you still need to do your best to help them to see the tricks that might get through if your technology didn't stop it. But you're better off, making sure your technology works really well, but you still have to do that awareness training for the users. And then as far as brand exploits and domain spoofing, Mimecast has a DMARC analyzer solution. They have a solution called Brand Exploit Protect. This is really valuable in making sure that your own company's reputation is not being hindered by, the bad guys on the outside. And like you said about APIs, having a way to take advantage of existing, investments where I liken this to, sometimes you're watching a Marvel movie with an individual, siloed superhero, and those are great. But don't you love when you can actually bring a few together and then have like a full-on Avengers battle, right? Well, so if you already have these investments and you've invested in things like Splunk or Palo Alto and such, you want to be able to have your security work together. And that's where Mimecast has APIs that can reach out and can work. It's two-way too. It's not just a one-way conversation, but it can reach out and take the lead in pulling these things together and working together in an environment.
Yeah, no, definitely. As I said, I quite love the API side of things. I mean, sharing, from a security point of view, and everyone, should look at this inside their organization. Sharing data that provides more context around your environment, what's going on in your environment, and sharing threats, between these technologies is no doubt in my mind a great way of actually not only increasing the value that you spend today on security technologies, but also, in actually saving you time on respond to threats and reduce that risk that way. And also, you mentioned another part of the integrations was into things like into automation, so security automation response, where you can actually start to look at, using Mimecast as part of your playbooks to alert yourself to new threats that are being introduced into the environment. JP, this has been great today. I mean, have you got any lasting thoughts that you want to share with people, or anything that you want to touch on briefly? I haven't got any further questions yet, unless anyone's got any questions. Is there anything you want to leave us with here?
No, I think this has been a fun conversation. I just hope that everyone understands that security is not something that you just put a label of good enough on. It's something that, and obviously, if you're taking the time to sit and listen to a conversation like this, then you probably already get that. You probably already understand that it's worth your time and your mental energy to try to put your mind around what's out there. What can you do at a reasonable price point to bolster your security for your environment, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud? Because just we live in a dangerous world. And more we're seeing these threats infiltrate our environments, and the damage reputationally, the damage to our customer data, the damage to our overall operation. It's just too great for us to just go with good enough or B- level security. Instead, we really need to look at the A players out there and see if we can bolster what we have, that what Microsoft has provided us in M365.
Yeah, no, that's great. I couldn't have said that better myself, and no doubt I never will. But no, thanks for that. I do really appreciate your time today. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for attending the session. Appreciate that time can be restricted for you all, so thank you very much. Look, if you'd like to hear any more about anything we discussed today, please reach out to either your account manager or myself. We have an email address called securityinfo@uk.cw.com, which I actually pick up those myself. We have a microsite you can visit for more information. But yeah, if there's anything you need answering, then please reach out. On that note, I bid you all a good day and thank you.